So there's a couple serious things, like, and I want to come back to my question for you, which I don't think you totally answered. I want to get it like, and there's no way to know for sure, but I mean, like, maybe it's because you're at an HBCU, actually. Maybe it's not as present to you. I mean, I imagine they couldn't be like upset about racism at Kentucky State, right? I mean, there's no concerns about the Klan being there, right? So you're not around that kind of student upset, but I have been. So, because I was at Columbia, I was at Occidental College, which is where the sex assault hysteria really was. It was the epicenter. A lot of the national leaders of that thing were at Occidental in LA. So, I mean, I've been around like lots of Black students and lots of women students who are really, as I said, really upset. And they really feel, let's just stick with the Black students for a second, like they are in danger on these campuses. And at Occidental, they protested, they surrounded a building, they occupied the president's office, they occupied the entire administration building. There was absolutely zero evidence of any kind of racism whatsoever. The security force at Occidental doesn't even carry guns. I'm not even sure they have flashlights. I mean, it was just utterly absurd. But, you know, there was crying, there was yelling, there was screaming, there was all sorts of demonstrations of upset. So the pain is real, right? There's real pain in our students. But I don't know how to address it because all they talk about is slavery and Jim Crow, right? It's always these, as you know, always these references to history, right? It's all about history is what's happening right now. The Ku Klux Klan, which is basically from history, is right now. So I have a theory as to why Black students in sort of the elite schools might have a lot of emotional upset.
Okay.
Right. That might lead to something like that. But this is really dramatic stuff. There's like really dramatic stuff going on inside of them. Now, the whole debate we're having is what the cause of that is. Like, what do you think? And why would Black kids at Yale University, right, as you know, feel like they are actually threatened and discriminated against and live in such an oppressive society, which is Yale? Why is that, do you think?
I think that this is one of those things, like I've mentioned that I'm at most center-right politically, but this is one of those things I'm actually quite conservative on, as many political scientists are. One of the things that outside the profession of political and military science, Americans tend to do is forget the horrors and evils of communism. We talk endlessly about Nazis, but I mean, it's almost inevitably forgotten that Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, individuals like this killed 3, 4, 5, 6 times as many people as Hitler did. There's nothing charming or original about socialist ideas beyond the level of just redistribution as taxes, which, by the way, I support. I don't favor privatizing the fire department or any of that sort of nonsense. But I mean, I think that, so this is something where I'm not at all conspiratorial, but where I really think that people with bad ideas are intentionally promoting those ideas throughout society. I mean, the communist theorist Antonin Gramsci long ago said that, if we're being frank, Rids, as he put it at the time, aren't probably going to take over the military anytime soon. This isn't going to be the group that dominates sport or agriculture or, you know, investment-based business. So you could go on down the line. So it's very important to seize control of the institutions of discourse in particular, by which you're talking about the media, you're talking about academia, you're talking about NGOs, whether or not it's intentional, because certainly I don't think every college professor in the country is a communist or anything nonsensical like that. But this, to a large extent, has happened. Very influential people. I remember for a while in the Chicago academic scene, we had Bill Ayers teaching and giving prominent speeches. This is one of the founders of the Weathermen. I mean, it's a guy who literally was a communist terrorist.
Sure.
Great dinner companion. Also communist terrorist. You know, we're a sophisticated city. Well, whatever.
Why not?
All kind of people at these events. Mayors, criminals, to the extent there's a difference.
Yeah.
But anyway, but in all seriousness, though, I think individuals in that position obviously do tend to be concentrated in the most elite institutions, and they tend to pass on these ideas. And as a result of this sort of march through the institutions, if you will, you see incredible discrepancies politically at the upper level of academia. I'm not sure what the staff of Foothills Community College looks like, but every time they survey the top 500 academic institutions, including my own, We see that about 90 to 95% of college professors are either political Democrats in our partisan sense or actual leftists. That's mirrored in the media. 93% of, to be fair, only national reporters, but were liberals or generally left-leaning moderates when Pew looked at this back in 2004. Yep. So I think that at a simple level, the reason why these easily influenced, somewhat innocent 17 and 18-year-olds believe this stuff is that it's constantly told to them by 93% of the people in authoritative positions.
True.
I don't know if there's much more than that. I mean, if you constantly, so this isn't even something that went into a journal article. It's a small, you can administer surveys in class as a professor, obviously. I was once interested in how Black and white students perceived interactions around them. So I gave a very short survey as an example of how to do methods that asked, how many negative interactions do you have in a typical day? Arguments, perhaps a fist fight at the very worst once a year, traffic altercation, so on. Black and white students had the exact same average number of negative interactions, which I believe was 9. But Black students attributed half or more of them to racism. So I think the short version is people are told constantly by those that have a certain set of discursive ideas that the USA, 1, had this terrible history, and 2, this has never really stopped. I'm rambling a bit here, but if you've been in an academic classroom and you've heard about white privilege and cultural appropriation and stereotype threat and implicit bias and so on. And from my perspective as a quant, I mean, the question is, what impact does that all actually have when you rack it up against the other side, affirmative action, stronger families in many minority communities, so on? And the answer seems to be not much. Asians out-earn whites, Blacks come within 85%, so on. So all of that would fall into these tiny 5% gaps. But if you haven't been taught that, you've been taught it's all there. Look, there's this, there's this, there's this. This is assimilative racism. By leftist radicals your entire college career, you're going to be very vulnerable to this kind of thing. I would add 2 other things there. 1, cancel culture means that most people are not aware of the actual statistical facts on these issues. This is one reason why, I mean, I have the luxury of being pretty personally well off after working in the sales field in Chicago. This is one reason I keep talking about this stuff. If you actually look at the numbers around police violence last year, and the Washington Post occasionally plays some minor games with these, but I mean, they're pretty consistent. Last year, there were, depending on which week of data collection you look at, between 9 and 15 unarmed Black men killed by cops nationwide. That was roughly proportional. There were a bit under 60 unarmed people total killed by police last year. So let's say 10 out of 60, there are exactly 6 times as many Caucasians as there are African Americans, almost exactly in the USA, 5 to 6. The total number of people killed by police overall, this included people brandishing guns, hitting officers with cars, waving Bowie knives in the air, that was 1,004.
Yep.
And of those, again, you're looking at 229 of them were Black. You can argue that there is a discrepancy between 14 or 15%, 12 to 14% before you get into interracials, African Americans in the population, and 20% of the police shooting victims. But the reality is that, at least among violent crimes, there is a higher overall crime rate in the Black community. So what you actually see if you look at this is these tiny numbers. I mean, you're talking about 10 Blacks versus 30 whites. And I mean, you can bring that into, well, who's overrepresented, us or them? But the broader point to me is that there are 40 people being discussed, or 50 people.
Yes.
And I think people just aren't aware of that. There's almost a conscious taboo on talking about it. So this is point 2. Point 1 is the leftist success of the institutions. Point 2, though, and point 2 has nothing to do with personal partisan affiliation or anything. It's just a fact. It's taboo to talk about things that would totally reduce these tensions. There are no epidemics. I actually have 2 chapters about this in my book, Taboo. One is there is no epidemic of Black people being killed by police.
Right.
Perhaps I'd be a bit more sensitive with that title if I had to write it again, but I think it's just a fact.
Yeah, it is.
50 people, and they're not all Black.
Right.
There are 340 million Americans. If you look at any actual resource use data pool, that's before you get into undocumented residents and so on.
Right.
So that's it. There were 89 people killed by bees, wasps, and hornets last year.
Yeah.
So your odds of being killed by a police officer, Black or working class white or whatever else, if you're just going to the bank, are lower than your odds of being killed by a bug. That's the real context in which this occurs. So that's one chapter. Another chapter looks at interracial crime and says more broadly this is true. Because I had both black and white friends over the past couple of years becoming absolutely terrified of one another. And it's kind of funny because I was born on the south side of Chicago. I lived in the pre-gentrification north side, and then I lived on the east side of Aurora, which is an Illinois city of about 400,000 people. And my Kentucky buddies, when I described that, asked essentially, weren't you terrified all the time? Weren't there black or Italian guys just driving by, shooting up buildings with Tommy guns? And you have to explain to them, like, no, what twice the crime rate means is that you'll be mugged twice in your life, not once. I mean, that's how that breaks down, by a dog. But then when I got to Kentucky, my Chicago buddies were saying, you know, they talk about blacks, but them poor whites, man, that's the crime rate, you know, meth and suicides. And they're not even necessarily wrong, but now I have to explain to them, like, okay, well, this is what 2x the suicide rate means. I mean, I've never lived in an area, and I don't spend a lot of time going to housing projects at 3 a.m. in a suit made of money, but I've never lived in an area where in a normal working class community of whatever ethnic group, you're going to experience a significant threat of violence. I think that's absolutely standard. Right. If you have a grad student apartment in Chinatown, you're not going to be robbed as the one, you know, Guaylo Fan in the area. These are exaggerated false narratives. Point is, I talk about this for a chapter, and I actually unpack the numbers on interracial crime. I take the raw tables in the BJS report, break them down. Yep. Last year, the percent of crime against whites committed by blacks, 15.3%. Black people, again, make about 14% of the population. That's it. Yep. What the entire hard right is talking about is a 1.3% difference. Boom. Whites did even better. Good job. I mean, I think this is a situation where both groups are doing what they should be doing. Whites made up 11% of the crime against blacks. Of course, we're a smaller community, bit less money. That's it. Right. That's the entire narrative on interracial crime.
That's the race war. That's the race war that we're supposedly in. Yeah.
Each group attacks the other 10% of the time. I mean, that's it. Yeah. You know, so when you actually look at this stuff, and there's no reason this logically shouldn't be true. Like, you can say black people have a slightly but definitely higher crime rate. Statistically, it can be twice the white crime rate some years. Okay. That's a fact. We need to work on that in the black community, just like the white community needs to work on hard drug use. Okay. But that doesn't in practice mean that this smaller community with its own issues is raging outside its borders and killing white people. It's not a thing that's happening. There aren't white people driving into the hood and killing black people either. Think about that.
That's right.
And this is true for most of these goofball narratives. When you look at things that are covered heavily in the media, like plane crashes, child kidnapping, think about the difficulty of, as a working income male of any race, walking into a neighborhood of strangers, going to a public park in America with our gun issue, what it is right now, grabbing a kid and walking away. What do you think would happen to you if you tried to do this? I mean, it's very rarely are these questions asked. But the underlying quite serious point here is I think people are unaware of these statistics. That's point 2.
Okay.
And point 3, very quickly, I think what we're seeing to some extent is a positive result of minority success in the USA. This is something that I wish would go away as a positive result. But we are in a situation where our curriculum, because the great ethnic groups were nearly at war 3 or 4 generations ago, discusses race very intensively. We spend far more time, you could argue whether appropriately or not, I actually do think appropriately, but on Martin Luther King than on the Wright brothers, or Alexander Hamilton, or massive chunks of American history. So all kids are aware of this stuff. And they're aware of membership in groups where they are supposed to feel oppressed, but nothing bad has actually happened to many of them.
Right.
I mean, again, I mentioned African Americans now earn something like 85% of what whites do. Asians beat the white mark by 9 or 10 points. These are well-adjusted middle-class children going to Yale. Yes. Whether you're making 90 or 110% of the white average, you're making a standard $80,000 to $100,000 a year in terms of your parents. It is very unlikely you've ever been beaten by a white mob or indeed a black one. Yes. So if you're fed this race narrative your entire life, but you come from a successful, happy family and your mom's a dentist, I find that people often shove the tiny incidents in their own life into a narrative alongside the larger serious things that happened to Dr. King or Rosa Parks. Right. And that's how you get people saying, a sentence I often hear when I debate woke students, if we're getting ready to work out of the gym or something, is like, the other day, a white lady looked at me angrily in traffic, and I know that Malcolm X was assassinated. And it's sort of, I mean, at a certain level, we have to start saying, well, one of those things isn't like the others.
Right.
Like, I understand that you have been taught this narrative of conflict and that bad things have happened in the past. And when minor bad things happen to you, it might be tempting to put them into that narrative. But it's worth asking, are those worse things than happen to, say, your Jewish buddy on a daily basis? And when you phrase the question that way, almost everyone says, no, now I understand. But the question is rarely phrased that way. Right. If I were a white academic, I would probably hesitate to phrase it that way because I might get fired.
Yeah.
Although I think in practice, that's fairly unlikely.